wheeling for Megaflex and large electricity users within the Eskom grid today, tomorrow, and the future. We'll trust it will be an interesting hour spent with some experts in the field. My name is Francois Viljoen. I'll be facilitating the proceedings today, and we've got three very good presentations lined up for you. Firstly, from Eskom, Shirley Salvaldi and Keith Bowen, that will discuss the wheeling rules, processes, and the Megaflex tariff adjustments. Then we will have a presentation by Robert Vatte from Cresco on the impact of wheeling on savings. And lastly, Alexandra Felikas from Weber Wenzel on the contractual structure and risk allocation of these wheeling PPAs. The team will make short presentations, and that will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions. So we encourage everybody to post their questions on the platform, and we will deal with these as we go through. And after each session, there will be an opportunity for interaction. Before we start, just some rules of engagement. What are we talking to today and what not? So the objectives are to unpack the current Eskom approach to wheeling. What future changes to the Megaflex tariff structure we should expect. Future energy market changes, impact of wheeling on savings to buyers looking to undertake private generation transactions, and risk allocation for wheeling. What we're not going to do today is talk about Eskom's latest GCCA and transmission capacity constraints and concerns, not talk about IPP tariffs for confidentiality and competitive reasons. We cannot talk about NERSA and what the 100 megawatt exemption announcement might mean, and Eskom long-term pricing curve. But I am sure without those, there will still be a lot of interest in what we do talk about. So if we can then, I can then move on to introduce the Eskom team. Shirley and Keith, they need both very little introduction. Shirley has been an Eskom corporate specialist with 40 years experience in the electricity supply industry. She is responsible in Eskom for electricity pricing policies, the design of tariffs, the development of the strategic pricing direction for tariffs, and the retail tariff submission to NERSA. And most recently, included in her portfolio is investigation into the development of the wholesale and retail tariff pricing strategy. And for those of us that's dealt with her before, she's the undisputed wheeling champion in Eskom as well. Keith is the wholesale manager in the Eskom transmission division. In this role, he's responsible for developing wholesale pricing mechanisms, supporting internal transfers within the vertically integrated utility, and payments to independent power producers. With the restructuring of Eskom, he is also involved in the developing future market mechanisms and trading arrangements between the transmission subsidiary and other industry participants. Looking forward to Shirley and Keith taking us through their presentation. And just a reminder, if you've got questions, please post them on the platform and we will deal with them after their presentation as far as we possibly can. Thank you. Over to you, Shirley and Keith.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. So this session is really just to share with you the Eskom rules, what our conditions are, and then obviously afterwards for some discussion on this. So just for background, all customers, both transmission and distribution connected, are provided with non-discriminatory access, which is required under our licenses and under the Electricity Regulation Act. But the important thing to note about this is that we have standard charges that are applicable to both loads and generators. We don't have special charges for generators that are selling through third-party wheeling or selling to Eskom, for loads as well, whether you're buying energy from Eskom or you're buying energy from a third party, there's standard tariffs. We've got policies and procedures and tariffs that support the facilitation of the reconciliation of energy. So there's a netting process that happens at the moment in the way that we deal with wheeling transactions, which I will explain. And the important thing is that wheeling is happening in South Africa. There's there's a few customers that are participating in wheeling transactions. And we've actually had an improved policy on wheeling since 2009. Next slide. So what are use of system charges and what is wheeling? So use of system charges are also referred to as wheeling charges. So we don't have special charges for wheeling. Our charges are standard tariff charges, and all energy that's delivered over a network is actually wheeled, whether you're buying it from Eskom or you're buying it from a third party. And these charges are not avoided when the energy is not supplied by Eskom. So the grid charges are payable. Generators pay use of system charges for the energy they export onto the grid, and these are called Gen Duos tariffs and are in our standard schedule of prices. But the important thing to note, we are busy at the moment reviewing these tariffs because they were actually designed in 2011 and the world has changed since then. For example, we provide a rebate for losses for distribution connected generators, but we know that generators in certain locations now are actually increasing distribution losses. Loads also pay use of system charges. We call them the network charges, and this is for energy consumed from the grid, and these are standard tariffs. The important thing is that only energy that is not supplied by Eskom is actually done is credited on the customer's account. We don't credit any use of system charges. And use of system charges are structures that recover the costs associated with the delivery of energy and making capacity available on this network for the energy that is not supplied, that is wheeled, or for all the energy that is actually wheeled, whether and in all time periods. We also raise connection charges. So this is applicable for new generators that are connecting, there will be charges associated with those connections. And our connection charges really recover the costs that are not recovered through use of system. So what are the conditions for allowing wheeling? We at the moment only allow wheeling for MV medium voltage, which is greater than 1,000 kilovolts. So it's not low voltage. We don't do wheeling on low voltage at the moment. The important things are generators need to have a license or registration from NERSA to generate and to wheel. The generators must apply for their grid connection, pay their fees, and sign all the required agreements. The accounts where the energy is being wheeled to, that customer must sign an amendment agreement to their supply agreement in order for us to do this crediting of the energy. The generator must sign the connection and use of system agreement and the amendment agreement to nominate off-takers. So in the generator's connection and use of system agreement, they will nominate who the buyers are or the off-takers, because sometimes the buyers are within a municipality and then the off-taker, on our point of view, is the municipality. They must be legally connected to the Eskom grid. We must have all these agreements in place. And if the buyer or the off-taker can be another Eskom customer, a municipality, or a customer within a municipal network. Where one of the parties buying the energy is located within a municipal network, the municipality then will also have to agree to the wheeling transaction, and Eskom does not have any say over whether the municipality will allow that or not. Next slide. So this is just going, I know it's very wordy, but it's trying to address all the kind of questions that we typically get asked around wheeling transactions. So how do we do wheeling? A lot of people think it's incredibly complicated. Obviously, for us that have been working with it for quite a long time, don't feel it's complicated, but there's obviously subtleties in this that you would need to understand. So the generator will pay for their use of system charges plus an admin charge. The important thing is we do not look at the distance between the generator and the load. Wherever the load is located, they will pay standard tariff charges for the delivery of energy plus the losses in that zone at that voltage. And the generator will pay their use of system charges at their voltage and at the zone that they're in. So we don't look at distance. We don't do point-to-point wheeling. So for loads, the standard tariff charges are payable for all the energy, consumption and demand that flows through the customer meter based on the standard time of use tariffs. And our time of use, in order to do wheeling, customers will have to be on a time of use tariff. They can't be on NightSave. We don't net the wheeled energy. We do a credit on the customer's bill, and we do this through a separate service agreement that gets loaded on the account called the Gen Wheeling Tariff. So you would get your normal charges for all the energy that flows through the meter, and then you get a separate, on your account, a separate service agreement called the Gen Wheeling Tariff. And that's where the credit is provided. And the credit is provided on a time of use basis, and it's done at an energy charge less losses. And we call it the WEPS rate less losses, which is exactly the same as Megaflex less losses. So standard loss factors, as I mentioned earlier, is applied to the wheeled energy, and it's the same for energy purchased from Eskom. So the credit rate excludes losses because there's still losses on the delivery of this energy, and those are standard loss factors payable by all customers. Important is that energy is credited in the same time of use periods as what is generated. We don't do any swapping of energy produced, say, in a standard period for energy that is consumed in an off-peak period. We've had queries on this. We produce more in standard periods, and then can we bank it and then use it in off-peak? That's not, we don't allow that. There is an additional charge for wheeling because of the administration that's involved. So there's an admin charge payable to do the wheeling because there's extra work that has to happen on this account. Currently, the charges that are not raised on the wheeled energy is a service charge. So we don't raise it as a new service charge, and the affordability subsidy charge. And that's really just based on the NERSA third-party transportation rules. We get this question a lot. If we wheel energy, are we exempted from load shedding? And the answer is no, because load shedding is a system issue, and if consumption has to be reduced, all customers need to participate equally in that scheme. We get also asked a lot of questions about banking. What happens if I produce more as a generator than what my customer can take in a month? Can we carry it over to the next month? We don't allow banking for any customers or generators that are greater than 1 megawatt. So that's our current banking rules. So low voltage, we don't do wheeling, as I mentioned before, for customers connected at low voltage. Another question, can a generator nominate more than one buyer? The answer is yes. but the required agreements must be in place on the buyer/off-taker side. And we do say that maybe going into the future, depending on how complex these arrangements might end up getting to, we might reserve the rights. So we don't want to have a 5 megawatt generator nominating 50 people. It does become an administrative nightmare. But generally, we're finding that customers are nominating 2 or 3 buyers. And of course, going on to the banking discussion, that if you do produce more than you can your customer can consume, you can always nominate somebody else to actually receive that energy as well. Again, subject to the amendment agreements being in place on the buyers or off-taker side. Deemed energy payments currently are a feature of the government programs, but that sits in the power purchase agreements, where if there is system events or curtailment, and depending on the criteria, Eskom is required to pay a deemed energy payment to the generator. But that is in the PPA and in the purchase agreements. There is no deemed energy payments that sits in our connection and use of system agreements. And for private sale, that we will not pay deemed energy payments. The standard conditions, as with any other customer, sit in those agreements. Eskom, the other important thing is Eskom only contracts with Eskom customers, generators and off-takers, and not with traders. Traders are facilitators, as we see in this scheme. They are dealing with the PPA. We deal with the physical flow of energy onto the grid, and then we do the financial transaction in terms of the buyer and the off-taker. Next slide. So this is just a very simple explanation of a wheeling transaction. I'm not going to go into much detail, but you'll have a generator that produces 100. The consumer there's 1,000 kilowatt hours that's going through the meter. So we then do the credits for the 100 kilowatt hours at this WEBS rate, excluding losses. The important thing is we never allow the bill to go negative. So if you do produce more than you've consumed, that will be ignored. Next slide. And then this is just a simple explanation of, we've got a worksheet that models that we give customers so they can see how this actually works. And of this bill, for example, will be on the buyer side, where you would pay standard tariffs. So the top part of it is dealing with all the energy that flows through. So you can see there's 23 million kilowatt hours that is going through this bill. But the wheeled energy is 662,000. So we do standard tariff charges for everything, and then we do the credits at the bottom in the green box, where you'll see, for example, your peak consumption. The standard tariff charge is R4.10, and that's all the energy that flows through that meter. So you are paying for the R4.10 includes losses, and then the credit is done at 370 cents, and that the difference is your losses charge, which is, as I said, is stock standard, payable by all consumers. So whether you're buying from Eskom or you're buying from an IPP, you will pay the standard loss factors. And these loss factors are also approved. So an offset is where there's import and export at the same point of supply. So you're not actually wheeling the energy from a remote generator. So at times you might be exporting onto the grid, and we provide then also a credit on the account. It's done slightly differently from wheeling in terms of the credit is currently done at the full tariff charge, because the losses, we say there's effectively no losses because it's import and export at the same point of supply. But the important thing to note is our credit is currently at the full energy charge, and we've kept it like that for a number of years. But going into the future, it will change. And my last slide on my side of the presentation, leading into Keith's, will explain one of the changes that we will be making on the energy charges, and this does impact the way the viability of projects. So people must be aware of that. And again, it's done in the same time of use periods as, so if you produce in standard period, you get a credit in standard period. We also don't allow extra, if there's excess, we won't allow banking unless it's caused by an Eskom event. There's also admin charges payable, and we actually do allow offset for customers connected to low voltage. And this is particularly, for example, people with residential PV on their roofs and so on. Also, this credit is not a purchase of energy, and both for under wheeling and under offset. It belongs to the customer. It doesn't belong to us. It gets put onto the grid. We use it. It's sort of the fungible principle where we use it, but we have to give it back to you at the end of the month. Next slide. And this just then provides a summary of the options. So if a customer is using energy just for own use and there's no export, the customer still needs to be on a time of use tariff, even if there's no export. It's one of our conditions. And they will still have to sign a connection use of system agreement, but there won't be any charges associated because there's no export onto our grid. Then there's the offset tariff, what we call Gen offset, and that's where the customer receives a credit on the exported energy at a certain rate. Then we do allow banking, as I mentioned, for customers smaller than 1 megawatt, and that's typically for seasonal users, such as farmers, but it's not allowed for anything greater than 1 megawatt, and that was really a requirement from our system operator. And then the wheeling, which I've gone into a little bit more detail, where it's done at a rate excluding losses. Next slide. So the important thing here is to actually talk about further developments in tariffs that may impact generators and wheeling. I'm going to talk through this, but I want Keith also on the generators balancing mechanism to actually lead, because this is going to lead into his next presentation. Our energy charges currently are volumetric only, so it recovers both the cost of energy and generation capacity through cents per kilowatt hour charges, and therefore they do not reflect the cost of providing generation standby costs in an unbundled way. And we often get asked this question that, okay, if the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing or my generator can't produce, will Eskom provide the backup? And obviously Eskom does provide that backup, but the cost of providing that backup is shared but amongst all customers, and we wanting to now unbundle our energy charges into a capacity related charge and an energy charge. And that is not just going to be applicable for customers with own generation, it's going to be applicable to all customers. So it is going to reduce the volumetric charge, the energy cents per kilowatt hour charge, and obviously this is the only charge that is going to be credited on the customer's account and not the generation capacity charge. And we are busy at the moment working on those proposals, and we are hoping to get this implemented in 2023. So there will be a full consultation process that will happen in next year. But we're obviously sharing this to all the customers so that they are aware that this is Eskom's intent, and it is subject to the regulator approving such a change. On the opposite side of us reducing the volumetric energy charges, we are also updating all our tariffs based on the cost of supply. And when we do this, we see the energy charges have actually increased and network charges have reduced. And that's really just a function of us applying average price increases to all the tariffs over the years. So when we correct this to properly reflect energy costs, the energy charges will increase. So even though there's going to be a reduction in the volumetric charge, there's also going to be an increase also at the same time when we restructure the tariffs. Thank you. I'd like to hand over to Keith now to deal with if he's got any comments on the generation capacity charge, because that is coming through from, no, just go to the previous slide. That is coming through from a wholesale perspective. So Keith, will you just talk about the balancing mechanism and any other statements you want to make on the generation capacity charge?
Great, thanks, Judy. Afternoon, everyone. So the idea of the balancing mechanism, historically, when we introduced the wheeling back in 2009, there was a lot of discussion around, but what about the integrity of the system? How do we manage the system from the system operator perspective when you can't dispatch most of these generators? So the idea then was, well, at the time we weren't expecting a huge amount of wheeling, and it didn't over the last 10 years, 12 years. The wheeling hasn't been huge. It's really quite small. It doesn't have a huge impact on the system. But the moment you start talking about 100 megawatts or anything above 20 megawatts, there's a risk to the system when a lot of generators are operating on the system, but there's no mechanism to ensure that they, one, predict accurately what they're going to put onto the system, and two, are then kind of bound to those predictions. So what we're talking about now is some sort of balancing mechanism. And this is kind of the norm in any sort of competitive environment around the world, that there has to be a balancing which accounts for the difference between what was planned, at least day ahead or some sort of time ahead, and what actually happened in real time. And when we are one big vertically integrated utility, then the fleet sort of backs itself up, and it's kind of inherent in the costs. But the moment you start having multiple providers and competition between generators, there has to be some accounting for those generators that are supporting the system and those that are causing imbalances. And at the moment, we're focusing on generators, but it might also apply for market participants in a future market. So when we talk about balancing, it's quite important that it's about getting in a prediction day ahead of what the generator is going to do for every hour of the day, and then also then metering them and making sure that there's some accounting for those differences. And that would apply to all generators that are licensed or registered by NERSA. The scheduling and dispatch rules, which have already been approved as part of the grid code, include a balancing mechanism. It's just never really been implemented. And that might be something that we would have to focus on. It's also a possibility that it's actually a simple standard charge that is approved by the regulator that gets built into the tariff book. But in the end, it might well be that we move towards a proper competitive environment, and that these charges then become part of that market. Thanks. If we can go to the next slide, Alexandra. Shirley's already talked about this issue of the capacity charge, the generation capacity charge. And here I'm just trying to put it in the context of the integrated resource plan. If we look at it from the IRP 2019, that there was a lot of expectation that the main supply of energy into the future is going to be renewables. It's becoming a key component of the market. But there's always the expectation that there has to be some sort of backup. And that's to try and make sure that we match the energy output with energy consumption. And that backup could be gas, LNG, gas-fired generation, or it could be batteries. And the idea is then, if that's centrally procured, there has to be some way to be able to recover the cost for that capacity, or you create a capacity market of some sort, even a price that incentivizes market participants to procure their own capacity. So that's why we're sort of driving one of the key components there is that there's some sort of capacity component that is built in. And here you can look at the slides afterwards. It's really talking about what happens when supply and demand aren't matching up. How's the gap, the residual, what we call the residual demand, being covered either by the system or by other backup capability. Thanks, Alexandra. And again, just to put it in the context of what we're talking about in terms of a potential future market, where you may have a market operator and a central purchasing agency and the system operator all functioning within a transmission subsidiary, but having different platforms in which people are able to participate. But the key thing here is that if a generator is selling to a large power user or municipality or any other customer, they would have, and it's a physical bilateral, that they are selling the energy through a PPA with physical commitments in terms of delivery and offtake. That's fine, that is the relationship between them. They both pay network charges and the energy gets wheeled across the network. But there has to be some accounting for balancing. And here we're just assuming that it's the generator would give declarations every day of what they intend to do. And then there would be an accounting through the balancing mechanism to ensure that they have, if they have deviated, they either contribute to balancing, or if they've actually produced more, they are paid for that additional energy at some balancing charge. So it's just really to try and true up between what was expected day ahead and what actually happened, and to encourage generators and in the future also other balance responsible parties, consumers, LPUs, to take on balance responsibility, that they then look after their own balancing and then not leaning on the system quite so much. I think in the next slide, we then just talk about the potential for an independent generator that might participate in the markets, and the physical components are handled in the market through a day-ahead market trading, the balancing, and then potentially also participation in the reserve markets, but that the generator and the customer could actually have a contract for difference or a financial arrangement between them that hedges against price risk in the market. And that then means that the physical issues are dealt with in the market, and then the financial risk and pricing can be done outside the market between the two participants. For those, when we talk about these sort of structures, we're really kind of suggesting that the market is already changing. We're seeing that there's going to be competition in the market. It's now about creating the right platforms and mechanisms to ensure that the liberalization is done efficiently and that the system is protected at all times. And yeah, that's pretty much it from my side then, Alexandra. And then Shirley, you want to add anything?
No, I think that's it. The rest of the slides are really just backup slides, just explaining the use of system charges, misconceptions about wheeling, that these additional charges, etc. And the next slide. So I'm not going to go through them. And then these are just the contracts required to facilitate wheeling, where you have the connection use of system agreement, and then there's an annexure to nominate buyers. The receiver of the energy, not the trader, signs a supply agreement, which normal load tariff, and then there's amendment, and this provides the credits for the wheeled energy. And then the generator contracts in terms of a PPA, which has got nothing to do with Eskom. Thanks. That's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eskom team. Much appreciated and very interesting. Just a reminder that if there's questions, please post them on the chat. Hopefully, it wasn't too higher grade. It does get quite complicated, as Shirley said, but after a few times, everybody should be able to navigate through. So far, we've just had a question in terms of the availability of these presentations. I believe they will be made available. So hopefully that will be helpful. I think next up, we do have pressure on time, so let's move on. It's Rob Vatter from Cresco. Rob has been director at Cresco for over 14 years now. He's experienced project finance advisor, but over the last few years, he's been focusing very much on the energy sector and spending a lot of his time, especially in the private offtake sector, working mostly for large energy users in South Africa, and assisting them in procurement of power, and in the rest of Africa, working mostly with IPPs and assisting them to structure projects and fund them. So over to Rob.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Eskom team. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Without going through specific names, I think key point to bring out are the ones in green, which were projects that were actually built, currently in the ground, largely cogeneration projects, which weren't restricted by generating license requirements because they were generally amendments to existing generation. Also, the projects, these didn't require project finance long-term PPAs, but these are the projects that we've worked on and have successfully implemented wheeling agreements of various stages, as Shirley mentioned, in place since 2009. So some of these have been operating for a while. As you can see, we're working for a number of buyers, and each buyer has their own requirements, their own long-term view. And what we are doing a lot for the client is obviously trying to optimize the tariff from the IPP. And to a certain extent, there's only so much you can pull the levers on in terms of the IPP, and it's linked to the PPA and risk allocation and that. But in many cases, you can get to a fairly good tariff for the IPP, but the overall answer around savings or how much balance sheet support you put up for these is very much driven by your view of Eskom. And it's your ability to move your demand within the time of use periods, as well as your future view of how Eskom will change, their price escalations, and obviously the impact of the Megaflex tariff structural changes that Shirley and Keith mentioned earlier on these 20-year PPAs that we're entering into. So on many cases, yes, it's focused on the IPP, but ultimately the answer is what is the impact on the load? And so we're doing a lot of the actual analysis around what is the impact of the IPP on the load, and different clients have different expectations on timings as well as their potential future demand. And this is really important in bringing out so the best answer for our clients. Next slide, please. So, time of use is changing. Eskom tariffs are going up. Everyone's got a different opinion, but it all going up in the same direction. And then the slide on the bottom right shows the split of sort of the energy charge cumulatively over the year with the fixed charges. And I think this brings out a little bit what Keith said sort of on his analysis. So yes, we can analyze the IPP, but ultimately, what is the impact on those fixed charges, the subsidies, and the change in the Megaflex, specifically around time of use, as well as impact on the generator capacity charges and impact on the overall Megaflex savings over time. So there's a lot of moving parts here that people need to consider, and Eskom is being very helpful by providing the Excel tool that allows us to mimic a typical credit. The problem is we need to take that mimics credit at a point in time and now project that forward for 20 years. And there's an element of crystal ball gazing, where what happens when balancing comes into the market. As Keith said, the rules are there, but the pricing isn't defined. And we're doing a lot of work for our clients around that sort of scenario analysis. We've probably reviewed over 200 IPP bids. So we have a fairly good idea around what's fair in the IPP space. But on the Megaflex side, it's very much more around development and as I said, crystal ball gazing. Next slide, please. So I think what a lot of people focus on, as I said, is it the lowest tariff? And what we've seen is there's quite a difference in approach between private sector PPAs and the REAP process. And that is, it's less around the lowest tariff and generation when you can, but it's more around offsetting the time of use tariff, specifically with peak in winter being so expensive and off-peak in summer being a lot cheaper, and we know there will be tariff changes. So what we're focused on is trying to get the IPP to sort of guarantee some minimum generation, so we have minimum savings, and then we offset that sort of potential generation profile, and solar and wind have different generation profiles that I'll touch on later, and we try and mimic the savings at a point in time. And over here you can see, if we use Shirley's Eskom spreadsheet based on the generation of a typical wind and PV project, we have an 83 cents credit, this is in 2020 terms. This will obviously go up over time and we project forward. Now then it is within the loads control to say, well, how does the solar and wind potential generation, does it change over time? What risk are we pushing onto the IPP? And ultimately, what risk do we need to take? And where do these savings go over a 20-year period? And this is a lot of the work that we're doing there. Now, we are conscious that wind and solar do have different solar degrades. Wind doesn't. So we're seeing that even small differences in the technology mix and the change is starting to have material impacts on the overall answer and what is the best optimal mix of generation from the client. In most of our client situation, there's an opportunity for some on-site generation, but generally not enough to achieve significant offsets. So we're having to look at wheeling to start getting those large penetrations to start achieving some of the renewable energy targets. So for most of us, we do have this discussion between the offsetting model, as Shirley mentioned, and the wheeling model. And based on the analysis we've done, if you did a like-for-like comparison, so assume you have the same generation profile, let's not use the word Northern Cape, in the Northwest, versus an on-site project, we tend to see that the benefit of an on-site is between 6 to 12 cents, depending on your voltage, but that can often be offset, obviously, by the irradiation factors in those periods. So a lot of that analysis is part of what clients keep on asking us, and what we've seen actually on the private sector space is it's not about the Northern Cape solely, just in terms of PV. There are other areas within South Africa that have also a fairly good, maybe slightly higher tariffs, but because of their time of generation, can actually be more beneficial for the buyer, specifically around offsetting peak. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of your current solar profile sort of today on current time of use, and then the solar profile over time. And you can see, and as well as wind. Now you can see on solar, the red is the ones we really want, because that comes in at the very high prices. But unfortunately, with the proposed time of use change, there's actually a significant reduction in the savings versus peak because of its sort of irradiation levels and decaying over the end of the day. Wind, on the other side, actually benefits from this change in tariff structure. And as you can see, that the amount of standard and off-peak are significantly higher because of the load factors that we see from a typical wind profile. Now, if you take into account all the potential changes that we believe Eskom will make and how we've modeled them, and I think we are spending quite a bit of time with Shirley and Keith trying to make sure that when we're trying to mimic their tariffs, we are getting it more accurately, and we're getting better, but I don't think we're there. But it seems to indicate that wind is generally a better scenario over the long term. But in reality, I think the answer is somewhere in between. And especially if you're balancing on-site generation as well as the wind wheeling, as well as the fact that there's potentially less wind sites available out there. But this for us is really important in terms of a client looking at their energy mix, specifically because most clients are not probably going to have one site and one generator or load. They're probably looking at a number of loads as well as a number of generators. So they're looking at a portfolio mix. So the portfolio of generation versus the load and the ability is becoming increasingly more important as opposed to a single project type engagement. And in the bottom right there, you can see the difference between standard and off-peak. And as Eskom starts to sort of smooth the difference between standard and off-peak with different increases in the tariffs over time, we also see the benefit of wind versus PV coming through. But as mentioned before, the benefits are really about managing your portfolio and coming out with an optimal solution, as well as in today's money, but potentially over time based on megaflex changes, as well as demand changes on the loads itself. Next slide, please. So generally, Cresco comes in and helps on the transactional advisory side. And I think what people underestimate is actually a lot around the adjudication. So there's no one single answer. There's a number of answers. And as I said, it's not about the lowest tariff, but around how the overall savings affect. So increasingly, we're spending lots of time with the clients working out what is their view of Eskom going forward. We've largely optimized the IPP as much as possible. Perhaps we can improve some of their funding structures. But ultimately, the preferred answer comes into what is the loads view of the world and how do they either cover their own demand usage or allow the IPP's portfolio effect to benefit. And then what people underestimate is that the bid that they receive today in the tariff is generally not the bid that you get at financial close. So a lot of the work we're doing there is around sort of transparency on the tariff and just things like the US dollar exchange rate or the underlying interest rate. We accept that between bid date and financial close, there's a number of processes, both internally as well as with NERSA, as well as with Eskom, that needs to be undone. And those dates can be 6 months or even longer apart. Hopefully quicker now with some of the regulations been loosened, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. So a lot of the work we're doing is actually giving comfort to the client that these IPP tariffs that they receive today are transparently transferred through to financial close, and that they're still getting savings over time, and that they still feel they're getting a fair deal, and that there's the IPP perhaps hasn't added some incremental profit along the way that wasn't part of their negotiations, and therefore giving everyone a higher chance of achieving financial close and putting some of this large-scale generation on the grid, whereas to date we've had limited sort of success for various reasons and mostly cogen related. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Francois.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks for the guys that posted some questions. Alexandra, we're going to come to you right away. I just want to field a few of the questions. We're not going to be able to deal with all of them right now, to just give Alex a proper chance for his presentation as well. But just very briefly, to the Eskom team, how would Eskom deal with an IPP wanting to wheel to multiple off-takers? Is that possible and allowed under the current structure?
Yes. So obviously we don't want thousands of multiple off-takers. So yes, we do allow more than one off-taker, provided that's contracted for on both the generator side and the off-takers.
Thank you, Shirley. And then maybe to Rob and Keith, with the suggested tariff reform, will Eskom backup charges compete with declining battery cost, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, from my perspective, a lot of it would depend on the regulatory decision around the backup charge. But from when we look at it, what's a reasonable cost for capacity would have to be impacted by what would we build from a system perspective to back up the cheapest capacity to back up renewables. And at this stage, that's still gas turbines. A CCGT plant, the capacity for CCGT is relatively cheap, particularly compared to a battery. So it might well be that the actual capacity charge would be influenced strongly by what that sort of alternative cost would be from a CCGT plant. But over time, as pointed out, if battery costs are actually now declining to the point where the capacity component starts competing with gas, then yes, it would be impactful. But right now, the capacity cost of a CCGT is much lower than a battery.
And perhaps I can just jump in here. So to date, we've only really seen large-scale battery interventions to allow technical benefits. So there's a project in Madagascar where there's a large battery, but largely supporting an islanded grid. We haven't specifically seen many battery solutions on firm bids. There's mostly been talk from IPPs, but we believe the crossover point is probably not far away. Medium-term risk mitigation has set some benchmarks, albeit for quite scale of battery. But we do see the opportunity for some peak shaving type batteries, either at the generator site or at the load site, definitely in the next couple of years, and these projects coming in. Our view is that batteries can be procured separately, doesn't have to be with generation. So it's part of your energy strategy. Batteries should be part of your plan, but perhaps not to be part of your initial RFP. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Frank, Trevor, I see your questions. We'll try and get back to them at the end, but I first want to give Alexandra Felikas from Weber Wenzel an opportunity to go through her presentation. Alexandra focuses on project finance and infrastructure finance, particularly as it relates to concessions, procurement programs, PPPs, and financing in the mining and energy sectors. She's part of the team advising the South African government on its renewable energy IPP process, procurement process, as well as the risk mitigation procurement process. Alex has honed in a skill set in the ever-growing private sector, captive and off-grid market, both in SA and across the continent, and she's acted for both off-takers and independent power producers in this space. Once again, somebody with a lot of experience. So, Alex, looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Francois. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I think it's been a very useful discussion thus far. So a little bit of the boring stuff, because I think the rest of it, I think the commercial stuff is where you start. But what we thought that we would do is we would put the wheeling transaction in context in terms of the broader contractual structure for a captive power project. So let's start in the middle. There you have your IPP or your seller under the power purchase agreement. It's usually it will be a special purpose vehicle company with its sole purpose being constructing and then operating the power plant. You have your shareholders at the top there. usually a foreign shareholder, foreign renewable energy developer, could also be local. Actually, at the stage that we're at, there's quite a few very good local IPPs as well. And then usually the shareholder 2 would be your black-owned entity or your local entity. Because of the high capital cost of the project, it's would be project finance, and that's where your lenders come in and third-party debt. So you'd see that there'd be various finance documents entered into between the IPP seller and the lenders. Important to keep in mind that the lenders will probably fund 80 to 60% of the total project. They've got a vested interest in every contract on the slide, but most importantly, the power purchase agreement that you see there that will be entered into with the buyer. The IPP will also enter into subcontracts for the construction and the operation of the facility, but will remain liable to the buyer for the conduct of those subcontractors. It will pass down and mirror the risks from the power purchase agreement down to the EPC contract and the O&M contract. Importantly, as part of the lender's security package, they would require the buyer, the seller, and themselves to enter into a direct agreement. What does this agreement do? It basically allows the lenders to step in and resolve any defaults under the power purchase agreement before the buyer can actually enforce its rights and terminate the power purchase agreement. So that's something quite unique to the structure, to a project finance structure that potentially, isn't employed in other sort of capital projects in the industrial or mining space that we thought we would note. Importantly, the seller, the IPP under a wheeling structure, will select the project site and secure the real rights for the project sites, as well as permit the site. So that very much is a risk that sits with the IPP seller and not the buyer in a wheeling context. In the red block is where we deal with the arrangements that Shirley and Keith have just taken you through. You'll see there that the IPP will have to enter into the connection and use of system agreement with Eskom. Okay, so that's the first part of your wheeling transaction. As Shirley mentioned, as an annex to that agreement, you would actually identify as the IPP who your buyers are going to be. So who you're going to deliver electricity to, and as Shirley's just confirmed, it could be more than one off-taker. Okay, the buyer then, which would already have a connection into the grid, into the Eskom transmission or distribution system, would then amend the existing electricity supply agreement with Eskom to taking into account the reconciliation and the crediting of any renewable energy that is then exported onto the grid by the seller for the account of the buyer. What we've also just included there, just important from a bankability perspective, is depending on the credit standing of the buyer and the risk allocation in the PPA, the seller and the lenders specifically may require that there's some sort of credit enhancement or payment support for the buyer's payment obligations. This obviously varies depending on who the buyer is. It could take the form of a third-party guarantee, a parent company guarantee, or short-term liquidity support. Just quickly wanted to take you through the key differences between whether you do an on-site project or a wheeled project. So first principle, and I did touch on it on the contractual structure side. On an on-site project, you usually have it that the buyer or sole off-taker of the electricity chooses a site adjacent or nearby to the facility that will get supplied with electricity. It will secure rights to the site and do obviously a preliminary assessment of the suitability of the site in terms of a resource and permits perspective, and then offer that site to the IPP. So there's responsibility there. In a wheeling context, basically what the buyer is going to go out and procure is say, these are how many megawatt hours I need. This is, and basically the IPP has to come back with either a partially or fully permitted site that can basically meet the requirements of the buyer. So site risk is completely an IPP's responsibility. Important that comes up a lot is that obviously these PPAs are structured on a take or pay basis in order to be bankable and secure revenue to repay the debt. So on an on-site structure, the buyer will pay deemed energy for buyer system events. They may also pay deemed energy for Eskom events and other curtailments, obviously depending if they can mitigate those events. On a wheeling structure, deemed energy would also be payable for buyer system events, including Eskom events or network outages that prohibit the buyer from taking electricity. And again, if this could be mitigated. So for example, if banking is permitted on the specific project, or the buyer is, through its arrangements with Eskom, can actually determine, where it reduces its demand on site. However, if Eskom system events actually affect the IPP or the generator, and that prevents them from actually delivering electricity to the metering or the delivery point, there would be no deemed energy payable in that instance, and the event would be treated as force majeure because that's what it is in its nature. No deemed energy would be payable by the buyer in that instance. Under an on-site PPA, it's become market standard to pay some form of termination compensation, even for seller default, usually equivalent to a portion or the complete project debt. And in consideration for that, the buyer then usually takes transfer of the project. On a wheeling project, there's a rationale to be said that the termination compensation, even for seller default and buyer default, could be a lot less than on-site due to the fact that the buyer would not take transfer of the facility. So the IPP would still be in a position to mitigate its loss by delivering energy output to another off-taker under another PPA. As we touched on as well, payment security, will be considered for both on-site or wheeling, payment security by the buyer. But again, under a wheeling context, there's an argument to be made that the payment security could be less than an on-site solution due to the fact that to the extent that the buyer stops paying, the IPP retains the project and could mitigate its loss by supplying electricity to another off-taker. On-site, because obviously the project site is usually the off-takers or it belongs to an entity that's at least affiliated to the off-taker. There are usually handover requirements and transfer provisions of the facility. Under a wheeling scenario, there wouldn't be transfer handover of the facility on expiry of the term, and the IPP would bear the full rehabilitation risk, as the buyer wouldn't take transfer, of the facility. So those are just key differences that you have to be aware of in terms of your risk allocation under on-site and wheeled PPAs. Thanks very much. Francois, happy for you to field a few more questions now.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, I'm aware that we've sort of run out of our hour's time, but for those that can stay behind, I'm happy to carry on for a few minutes and see if we can cover as many questions as possible. Shirley, Keith, I hope you're ready, because most of them seem to be directed to you. So let's start with a question from Fatima. In order to create project certainty, will Eskom, subject to NERSA approval, be prepared to conclude long-term agreements regulating the use of system charges and generation wheeling tariffs, credits, etc.? I think a question that comes up quite a lot. What do you think of that idea?
So the simple answer is no, because that becomes a non-standard contract. Because we can only charge tariffs that are approved by NERSA. So we would have to go to NERSA and we'd have to ask for that to be a special contract. And the problem, of course, is if we enter into that long-term agreement, there's all other kinds of issues in entering into long-term agreements. For example, if the tariffs are actually for all other customers are higher and this tariff for this customer is lower, you're starting to create subsidies, which means that other customers end up paying for it. So it's not something that we would look at unless government says that we must do such a thing. But it does. It creates subsidies and it creates discrimination.
Thank you. Then maybe a next question by Trevor. Can wheeling be affected from South Africa to Namibia with the same wheeling charges, or would there be additional cross-border charges? So now we're moving into the SAP space, I guess.
Yes, we're moving into the SAP space. So wheeling charges in South Africa would be the standard tariff charges. But maybe, Keith, I don't know if you want to just talk about cross-border.
Yeah, thanks. Cross-border brings in a lot more complexity in terms of currently most of the cross-border is dealt with under the Southern African Power Pool. You would have to then become members of the Southern African Power Pool. There would have to be regulatory approval. But our biggest stumbling block is around the interconnectors, and making sure we have rules as to how you allocate capacity on the interconnectors, particularly if you have multiple people trying to wheel through that same interconnector. What happens if the interconnector is not available, for example, and then we have to deal with balancing between the control areas. So particularly for the example, if you're going to Namibia, it's not as problematic because Namibia falls into our control area under Eskom. But if you're going across to Zimbabwe or even through to Zambia, there are intercontrol area responsibilities for the flow of energy. And those are things that we would have to factor in. It's not to say that it can't happen. These are just things that we need to put in place to ensure that that's viable.
Keith, maybe I can just add to that. So we've done a few SAP wheeling opportunities, primarily coal in Mozambique for a while, and then hydro and that. And I think the inter-SAP market is well understood. The charges are actually quite low, probably too low. I think it's often around what are the utilities going to charge or within their own wheeling frameworks. And then your points about becoming a member of SAP as a South African load or IPP, I think that's still got a bit of political issues to cover on. Thank you.
Thank you. I think lastly, Frank Spencer has asked a whole bunch of questions from Shirley and Keith. And I think some of that will be addressed offline, but I don't know, Shirley, Keith, if maybe want some sort of a general response, or do you want to take all the questions and deal with them separately? And I think we'll make this the last question and then we'll close up for today.
I can address those questions and Keith can come in as well. On the first one, gen offset, remember gen offset is on-site generation, so there's import and export at the same point of supply. So the generator might be a non-related party to the customer, but the offset is actually done on the customer's account. Whether they're non-related or related, obviously there's issues around that in terms of licensing. Under wheeling, if you're a generator that sells to more than one party that's not related, you would have to be licensed under the current Schedule 2. So going into, and we don't know what's coming out in the new Schedule 2. On the second one, if the generator is located next door to the off-taker or on the other side of the country, the cost to wheels that remains the same. It's not. Remember, what we're saying is the wheeling is where the generator is located. They pay for their own use of system and wheeling costs, and the load pays as well. So what we are with offset, we're saying there's import and export at the same point of supply. So this generator is putting onto the grid, and then you're taking off from the grid, and that's why we do the credit currently at full tariff. Going into the future, it's going to probably have to be more associated with our avoided cost. Then on the third one, a large generator constrained supply could be creating value for Eskom in terms of reduced load. So remember again, generators where they're located get the benefit or cost for where they're located. So if you're going to be a generator that decides to put up a plant in Mpumalanga, where we have a lot of generation, that is a challenge for Eskom. So your generator use of system charges, you would have positive losses charges. But if you're located in the Eastern Cape, your losses charges are negative. So the generator gets the benefit for where they're located. That's how the current use of system charges are calculated. Should the wheeling charges simply be related to cost value, and actually could lead to Eskom paying the generator for the value created? So again, use of system charges and energy charges are separate charges. Use of system charges are the network, and you have to almost start looking at Eskom as three components. One is the energy supply, one is transmission networks, and the other one is distribution networks. So where the network costs are the network costs. We don't look at the value of the energy benefiting the grid other than in the way the use of system charges are raised. So if a generator is in a high constrained area, they again will get the benefit of the use of system charges in that high constrained area. And that's really how the use of system charges work. We mustn't confuse the use of system charges and what's payable under use of system charges versus what gets netted. The balancing mechanism for generators. Keith, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can do that one quickly. Yeah, you're correct there, Frank. It is because it's built into the grid code. We actually, if you look at the scheduling and dispatch rules, the balancing only applies to larger generators. I can't remember the exact size. I thought it was 20 megawatts, but I could be wrong. But so potentially balancing in the future may have a size limitation, but you've also just got to be careful, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of small generators which could be deviating from their schedule. There has to be some sort of balancing. It may not be as onerous, but there needs to be some sort of accounting mechanism for balancing. But at this stage, as if we look at the scheduling and dispatch rules, there is a size limitation.
Do you want to answer the next one?
Yeah, okay. I think we just also have to be very clear that use of system is very different from balancing. Use of system is about the network. It's about the use of the transmission and the distribution network. It's for the construction, maintenance, upgrade of the network, dealing with the losses on the network. Balancing is about energy flow. It's about being true to what was scheduled day ahead in terms of that. So they are very, very different, and that more than likely both would apply to any particular generator and potentially consumer in the future.
And then on the final point, I think that links to the other question that was asked about a long-term framework. We all agree that we'd like a long-term framework, but everything we do is subject to what the regulator approves. Going into the future, and Keith did hint on this, is that we will probably move from bilateral contracts going into the future into a market based system. So we're not continually changing the way we do things. I mean, our current mechanism has been in place now for 10 years. Prices are changing, and that again is subject to cost issues. We are working on in the introduction of the capacity charge and the tariffs as such, one, to make sure that they are more cost reflective in terms of structures, and two, to support what is actually going to be happening with the Eskom unbundling. Because once Eskom is fully unbundled, distribution will be looking after its own charges, transmission will be looking after its own charges, and in the energy space, which will be Eskom generation, plus the RPP costs, those costs will also be looked after, even though the Keith sitting in the wholesale, or the wholesaler, or what will eventually become a purchasing agency, will deal with the purchase of energy from Eskom generation and RPPs and in future. So that is a dynamic environment, and to give long-term price certainty in what effectively is going into the future into an Eskom unbundling and restructuring, where things are going to be different. Obviously, we're trying to put pegs in place now so that this becomes sustainable. It gets done under a proper framework. We know that government is looking at revising the EPP, the electricity pricing policy, because the EPP was written, I don't know, what was it, 2006 or something. Industry has changed. So yeah, what we are trying to do is to actually start putting the frameworks in place so that it becomes at least a much more not sustainable, but a much more that there's a framework in terms of how we're going to go into the future. But long-term certainty at this stage, no, that's, that can't be provided, unfortunately.
Thank you, Shirley. We're well over time now, but I think it was well worthwhile hanging around for a bit longer. So I thank everybody for their participation. Thank you to the speakers. I think there's some really great insights that was shared. I'm sure if there's questions, you're welcome to put them through directly to the speakers, and they will be more than willing to answer where they can. And we look forward to seeing you on a similar webinar in the not too distant future. Thank you for all your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.